Caroline Lucas, MP, for coming along. It's really exciting that she has come down and given her up her busy schedule to come to Reading to try and promote the good work that the Green Community can and have been doing in this area. So Caroline is going to talk to us a bit about what Greens can offer people if they choose to start voting for them, and she also knows that well because she's been doing that in Brighton for a number of years. I myself would like to say that Caroline to me is a very inspirational lady in achieving what she has achieved whilst being a mum as well, and we've got mummies here who appreciate the challenges alone of being a mum, let alone trying to become an MEP and an MP and the many things that she has achieved. So we are going to hear from Caroline now, and then we've got a few people that have already indicated that they'd like to ask questions. We are pushed for time, so it's not going to be a case of opening it out to everyone. But if you do perhaps have a question which we haven't been able to ask, perhaps you could field them to any one of us wearing the green badges, and we will try and take a note of that and see if we can answer them for you after today. Okay, so Caroline, it's over to you.
Well, thank you so much. This is such a lovely place to stand and talk from, actually. We've got Westminster outside. It might change the nature of the debates, I think. But I'm really pleased to have the opportunity just to say a few words. And what I wanted to do was just give a bit of a pitch to you really about why the Greens matter, both nationally and locally, and obviously the local elections in mind. What we want you to do is to vote for more Greens here in Reading. But maybe I could just tell you a little bit from a kind of broader perspective and then hone down. And what I always say to people is that there are really three key reasons for voting Green, and they're the obvious environmental ones, but also social ones and economic ones. And most people know about the environmental reasons for voting Green. And most people don't have a great deal of confidence in a government that says that it's going to be the greenest government ever. I mean, I always point out that's not sadly very difficult because we've had particularly green governments in the past. But even by that fairly modest ambition, they're doing pretty badly. And for example, a lot of local areas, I don't know if it's affected you here in Reading, but in Brighton it's certainly affected us around the solar feed-in tariff. We had ideas of putting lots of solar panels on some of the council houses and council buildings in the city, which would have been really good for getting the emissions down because it's switched to renewable energy. But it would also have brought in an income stream which the council could have then recycled and used locally in terms of investment in more affordable housing, for example. So those are the kinds of practical schemes that the Greens want to see happen, but the government suddenly changed the rules around solar feed-in tariffs. It suddenly changed the amount of money you're going to get and some of the other conditions associated with it, and has basically thrown a really growing industry into complete chaos, basically, having been lobbied by many of the solar companies who've sprung up in recent years, one of the fastest growing new industries, and now they're all really struggling as a result of the government's changes there. Many other things I could say on the environment about the government's actions, with trying to sell off the forest, for example, or just changing all of the planning rules. Fortunately, there was a big backlash about the change to the planning rules, and some of that is now, they rode back from their position, more or less tearing up all of the planning rules. But again, you'll know how important green spaces are to busy towns like this one. And so it's really important that we have a proper balance between, yes, more housing, particularly affordable housing, I'd underline that because so often housing is not actually affordable for local people, but also maintaining green space for our kids and for everybody, really, the lungs of our urban spaces. In terms of the environment more locally, I know that the others will say far more about some issues, I'm sure, around transport and the importance of public transport. It's no good governments lecturing us to leave cars behind if there isn't an affordable, effective local transport system, not just within the town itself, but joining up to some of the villages. And I used to live in a village just outside of Oxford, and it was wonderful if you wanted to go by bus until 6 o'clock in the evening. But if you ever wanted to go out in the evening after 6 o'clock, then you just simply couldn't by bus until the buses stopped. So having that good network of public transport is something that the Greens are standing for very strongly locally as well. But actually I wanted to spend more of my time just now talking not about the environment, because a lot of people will say, yes, we know about you and the environment, we know that, but what about health, what about education, what about pensions, what about some of those social justice issues that people really care about as well? And the case I want to make is that the Greens' social justice and environmental justice, fairness and the environment are absolutely connected. And we would argue that our offer, if you like, on some of those social issues is incredibly strong. I mean, for example, when it comes to the health and social care bill that's just been going through Parliament just now. You know, the Greens, well, why? In my case, because it's me representing the Greens in Parliament, but absolutely at every point making the case that the NHS should be, in public hands, it's a public service, and we don't want to see more and more privatisation, essentially, of that service. And although Labour, we're doing a good job of fighting it as well, at the risk of being a bit party political, one can't help but just point out that Labour really did accelerate the commercialisation of the NHS when they were in power. And so if you're looking for a party that stands on its principles, and when it says it opposes the privatisation of public services, it means it, then that is the Greens, because we have always said that those key public services should be kept in public hands, free at the point of need, and a proper public health service. In fact, I shocked some of my colleagues when I was speaking about the health bill, because as well as maintaining the point that we want it to be a proper, fully public health system, I was just reminding people that in other parts of Great Britain, like in Scotland, they still manage to have free dental care, and free prescriptions, and some of these things that we've kind of forgotten that once were free as well. And so, that's absolutely part of what we stand for. On education, I wanted to say a few words again. We're very concerned about government's push for more and more academies, not from purely academic grounds, but just if you look at what happens to the rest of the schools in a local authority area, the more you have academies, then the harder it is to plan across a local authority area, and also the economies of scale that you might get, things like a music service that would be spread across a number of different schools in a local authority area. That is much harder to provide if you've got a number of schools that have already opted out. And so what worries me is that you might be able to make a case that people will get a better education in the academies. Actually, I don't think the evidence proves that. But even if it did, the impact on all the other schools simply isn't fair. We ought to have a system of education where we can have confidence in all of our local schools, having good local schools, no matter who's running them. But I'll end by saying a few words about the economy, because some people would say, well, we might trust the Greens on the environment, we might perhaps trust them on the NHS, but the economy, wow. And I want to say to you that actually I think that the evidence of the last few years has demonstrated why the Greens are right on the economy as well. I don't think that George Osborne's austerity package is working. I think that it is clearly hitting women hardest. And it's not just me saying that, you've got people like the Institute for Fiscal Studies saying this budget is a budget for the rich, not the poor, and of those people who are not rich, it's going to be the women who suffer most of all. And that's for at least three reasons. First of all, you'll know that George Osborne's answer to the deficit is basically to throw out of work a whole load of people in the public sector. And if you look at who's most likely to be working in the public sector, it's more disproportionately women. So women are the ones to get thrown out of work first, and that's demonstrated when you look at the jobless figures. Women have been disproportionately represented in those figures. But then if you ask yourself, well, who depends on public services most, whether that's public transport or the NHS, who's most likely to be in that kind of either the caring role in terms of kids or elderly parents, or who's most likely not to have their own car and be dependent on public transport, again, women most affected. So they're affected, we are affected when we lose jobs, but we're affected when those services then are not properly provided. And finally, it's like a triple whammy, we're also affected because if those public services aren't there, then who has to step in, to look after relatives or whatever it is that you can't now get from some kind of public service? It's women again. And now we're not naive about the deficit. Of course the deficit needs tackling, but our argument very strongly is that you don't do it by throwing out of work up to 500,000 public sector workers and then just assume that miraculously the private sector will come in like, knights on white chargers. And it's clear that's not happening. The vast numbers of jobs that have already been lost, 270,000 in the last year in the public sector, have not been replaced by private sector ones. And of course the reason is fairly obvious in the sense that the private sector and the public sector are intimately linked. They're not somehow two completely separate bubbles. And if you've got people being thrown out of work in the public sector, unsurprisingly they're not going to be going to so many private shops or cinemas or all the other things that you might use services in. Our line is that actually the real crisis is around joblessness, the numbers of people out of work, 17-year high without unemployment, and over 1 million young people, the highest on record of young people out of work. And our argument is the best way to solve the deficit, if you like, is to get those people back into work again, to get them back into jobs, because that gets their tax money back into the revenue. It means you're not